The Legend of Zelda has always gone through a couple of changes. There hasn't been a single game in the series which hasn't had a major change in its design choice, graphics-wise or gameplay-wise. However, none of them parted the Zelda fanbase as much as this one did. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Back in the year 2000, Nintendo showed a tech demo of what the GameCube is capable of at Space World. They also showed a few seconds of what seemed to be a teaser trailer for the next Legend of Zelda. The people went wild and were looking forward to this new, awesome-looking Zelda game. A year later, actual gameplay footage was shown at Space World and the people went nuts. Some people liked the art direction Nintendo went with, but the majority hated it.
If we have a look at this demo of Space World in 2000 and compare it with the final version of The Wind Waker, a few might still say that it would have looked better if they stick to the original plan. But the majority will agree that The Wind Waker does a better job in showing the world in its own colorful way. Even today, people say that the game was gorgeous looking for its time. Why is that? Could it be that Nintendo was aware of the fact that cell shading graphics age better than regular graphics? But what is cell shading? This is a rendering technique in which elements such as shadowing are not rendered in a gradient fall-off. They are using more of a threshold technique. This means that if the shadow that is meant to be displayed drops below a certain value, the shadow won't be rendered at all. And if it's above it, it will always look the same. This ends up giving games a very cartoony look. But let's look into why Nintendo decided to go with this. First of all, the graphics age way better than regular graphics do. This happens because they can use basic colors. For example, pick a 512 by 512 texture and another texture that is just plain green. 10 years ago, this texture would have looked amazingly detailed. But if you scale it to 1080p or 4K today, the result is horrible, at best. But if you do the same with a texture that is just green, it will stay just green. It will still look good. This way, cell shading graphics can maintain its visual quality over a long period of time without looking less visually impressive.
Wind Waker was one of the first games to go with cell shading and pretty much the first one to go with this kind of art style for the entirety of the game. The first game to use this rendering technique was Jet Set Radio. However, it didn't use it everywhere. If you look at the game, you will notice that the game still looks alright, despite being almost 17 years old now. This works due to the high contrast of the objects and the cell shading used on the characters. If you check the surroundings though, you will notice a lot of blurry textures. Little detail and no shading on the texture itself. However, the technique was still so new back then, no one could have even guessed it would turn out like this. So people cried out for a more realistic and darker Zelda. And that's what they got a couple of years later. That's when Twilight Princess was released. Well, it wouldn't be entirely right to say that Twilight Princess was a reaction to the people asking for a more realistic Zelda, as the development most likely started when The Wind Waker wasn't even out yet. But the reaction at Space World 2001 was probably fierce enough to at least have some impact on the design choices for Twilight Princess. If we compare these two nowadays, these two still look good, but it's undeniable that Twilight Princess aged more than Wind Waker did. But it wasn't only the art style that made Wind Waker to what it is today. Nintendo stated that they always try to push the games to its limits when it comes to map size. Comparing the overall map size of Twilight Princess and Wind Waker, we notice that the map of Twilight Princess is barely bigger than the one in Wind Waker. However, the map of Twilight Princess is divided in parts. There is no seamless transition like there is in Wind Waker. This is most likely due to the texture size that has to be loaded. Once again, another reason to go with cell shading, as the textures don't have to be as detailed as they have to be with the shading used in Twilight Princess. However, The Wind Waker suffered under this aspect. The ocean was too empty most of the time. The sailing took up too much time and felt more like a filler to extend the playtime. In the long run, the ocean seemed like a mistake, which is probably why the Swift Sail was introduced in The Wind Waker HD. The world without the islands felt empty, and there wasn't much to do except for waiting until you arrived. A few people even went so far to compare The Wind Waker with The Elder Scrolls Daggerfall. We think that's a little exaggerated. Daggerfall's map was, let's not talk about that.
But it probably wasn't planned to be this way. As we already know, Nintendo had planned to implement a lot more islands into the game. And this wouldn't have been a problem, since rendering those islands and displaying them on your way there would have been much less of an effort than it would have been for a game like Twilight Princess. Back to the topic. Wind Waker was not Nintendo's first attempt to head towards cel shading. In 1999, another game was introduced by Nintendo that was meant to have cel shading graphics, The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. However, for some unknown reason, this one ended up with pretty much the same rendering technique Ocarina of Time used. Chances are that it didn't work out due to the low poly count of the game objects. But this is really just speculation. Nowadays, people are still complaining. But not about the Wind Waker itself, more about Nintendo's decision to stick with a cel-shaded graphic style. Looking at Skyward Sword, it kind of made the same mistake that Jet Set Radio did. The characters look amazing and hardly age due to the rendering technique. But taking a closer look at walls and such, or the rendering distance, one realizes that this game also has blurry textures. But it could also be some sort of art style, as the game looks a lot like it was hand-painted. Today, quite a few games use cel shading for their own advantage. And one can certainly say that hardly any of those really aged as much as the ones trying to achieve realistic graphics. Cel shading games will probably never look as good on their release day as their competitors that try to go for realistic graphics. But usually, that's not even the goal of the game developers. To be honest, you can't even compare them, as the art styles are way too different. Nintendo probably tried to go with a new art style in the Wind Waker, and because of the limitations of the system, this came in quite handy. If those limitations still apply today is debatable, but I think a lot of us can agree that even old cel-shaded games are still nice to look at. And maybe that's why Nintendo decided for the Zelda franchise to use the cel-shading style. Thanks for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed this new video. We call it Game Design Theories, where we theorize about certain game design choices. If you want more of these episodes, then vote in the upper right corner. Yeah, there's a little voting poll system. Just click on the yes button, or the I want more button. I don't know what I'm going to set for this. And then tell us in the comment section down below what you thought about this. Yay!